At Eastbourne in Sussex, there was a private school run by Thomas Hopley from his home at 22 Grant Parade. Outwardly, he was well educated and appeared to be a gentleman. But in 1860, that changed when he was accused of murdering one of his pupils. In the neighbouring county of Surrey lived one of the masters of the Court of Common Pleas, John Henry, Chancellor. He was the father of 15-year-old Reginald Channell, Chancellor. The boy was described as dull, heavy, melancholy, and he was mentally impaired, meaning he found learning difficult. He couldn't grasp arithmetic and also had difficulty with money, not knowing the difference between a shilling, a sixpence and a fourpence piece. After trying so hard to figure the sums out, he eventually gave up, becoming stubborn and refusing to try any more. However, when he was away from his studies, he was a gentle and loving boy who adored his relatives, especially his parents and siblings. It later transpired he'd been suffering from hydrocephalus, once known as water on the brain, although it's actually cerebrospinal fluid, not water. Nonetheless, the young lad had been sent to Hopley's school to try and further his education in October 1859, with his father paying the £180 annual fee to the schoolmaster. That Christmas, when he'd arrived home, it was clear to his family he'd suffered severe punishments at the school, but they decided to send him back anyway. He came home again at Easter 1860, then said his last goodbyes to his family, for they would never see him alive again. At the beginning of that term, Hopley wrote to Chancellor, telling him he had great difficulty in inducing Reginald to learn. He informed him it was his intention to use more severe forms of punishment against the boy, and that he must be allowed to do this in order to see that he'd conquered the boy, as he put it. Chancellor believed that the worst punishment the schoolmaster could mete out was the cane, so he gave his blessing. This was a mistake. Now, with permission from his father, Hopley was free to punish Reginald in any way he wished. On Saturday, 21st April, Reginald had been in the playroom when he was told by a housemaid, Alice Deacon, to go to the dining room at around 9 o'clock that evening, where Hopley was waiting for him. She then went down to the kitchen, but heard Hopley called the boy to go to the pupil room. It was the last time she saw Reginald alive. There, Hopley produced a lesson book, but was ready to deal with the stubborn boy with a skipping rope and walking stick. Shrieks and groans emanated from the room as Hopley thrashed the youngster. Alice and other domestics at the school, including the cook Fanny Holland, would later testify they had heard the beatings, then short pauses, followed by a run, a struggle, then the sound of blows and a heavy thud as the boy fell. This went on from 10:15 until 11:45 that evening, and by this time the room was covered in blood. It soaked through the carpet and wet the floor, some of the pools as large as a hand. The rope and the stick too were covered in blood, but still the boy hadn't been conquered by Hopley, and he was sent to bed. Reginald either wouldn't or couldn't go, so Hopley dragged him up the stairs to his dorm. Here again he rained down the blows on the boy, as he was determined to break him. In the next room, the frightened nursemaid Ellen Fowler heard it all. She heard Reginald say, "and 4, as if he was trying to work out something numerical. She heard further blows and groans from the room. Men from the Coast Guard, whether they heard what was happening or not, had their attention drawn to the light in the room, as by now it was 1 o'clock. As the nursemaid lay listening, everything suddenly went quiet. She assumed that at that point Hopley had done as he'd set out to do and had conquered the boy. Yet she knew something wasn't right. It transpired the dorm was just as bloody as the pupil room. Blood was found on the stair, on the bed, on their clothes, and on the floor. Reginald was crying quietly and asked if he could lay his head on the schoolmaster's bosom. The master agreed, even though the boy was dying, kneeling down and praying with him in the blood. Then all hell broke loose. Lying in their beds, the servants could hear water being poured out and someone running up and down the stairs. The schoolmaster's wife, Fanny, was helping him clear up the blood. The next morning, the 22nd, Reginald was found in his bed, dead. So the unassuming Hopley sent for Dr. Barnsby Roberts, and he saw the body in the bed. He couldn't ascertain the cause of death, but the following day Hopley called on him for the death certificate, which he said he couldn't give. Hopley had tried to tell the doctor the boy had a heart condition, and that may have been the cause of death. Coincidentally, Hopley had cornered Mr. Emery, the registrar, before the church on the 22nd, telling him he wished to register the death of Reginald. He told him that wouldn't happen until after an inquest was held, to which the schoolmaster said he was anxious to avoid an inquest on account of the deceased's family. The question remains, however, why did he not send for the doctors sooner? Apart from his head, the rest of Reginald's body was covered up with long stockings covering his legs and white kid gloves on his hands. But when these were later removed during the post-mortem examination on 28 April by Dr. Prescott Hewitt of St George's Hospital, along with Dr. Willis and Dr. Holmes, the full horror of what had occurred was laid bare. His body was a mass of bruises. The skin on his thighs was torn and lacerated, and on his right leg there were 2 holes the size of a sixpence, an inch deep. The schoolmaster, along with Reginald's 26-year-old brother, the Reverend John Henry Chancellor Jr., stood over the body, holding hands, when Hopley said, astonishingly, "Heaven knows I have done my duty by that poor boy." Hopley was finally arrested in early May, but following a preliminary hearing, he was released on £2,000 bail on 16th June. On Monday, 23rd July, at Lewes, 41-year-old Hopley appeared before Lord Chief Justice Sir Alexander Cockburn. The prosecutors in the case were John Humphreys Parry and William Jerome Knapp. The doctors who'd carried out the post-mortem testified that some of the injuries had occurred due to a heavy blunt weapon, and the stick produced in court was what had inflicted them. The rope had caused bruising, and the stick the lacerations. It was during the examination that hydrocephalus was confirmed. Dr. Hewitt also told the court that considerable violence had been used, and that death was caused by shock to the nervous system and by the large quantity of blood extravasitated into the cellular membranes. He also informed the court the death had occurred around midnight. At the trial, Ellen Fowler also stated she noticed blood all over the house and on one of Hopley's candlesticks, which had been left outside Reginald's bedroom. Jane Johns, a laundress at the school, testified that on Monday 23rd April, she'd received some articles of clothing from Hopley, his wife and Reginald, some of which had spots of blood on them. Hopley himself lied about the last time he saw Reginald, stating he last saw him around 10:30 that night and that he'd found him dead the following morning at around 6:30. He made no mention of the gruelling and cruel repeated beatings he'd given him. Hopley's solicitor, Sergeant-at-Law William Ballantyne, addressed the jury, telling them that his client had no intention of killing the young lad, and that the melancholy result was to a considerable extent to be attributable to accident. Hopley was convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter, on Monday 30th July, and sentenced to just over 4 years in prison. A few months after the death of his son, the Reverend John Chancellor died on 22nd June 1860 of what some would term a broken heart. Fanny Hopley filed for divorce from her husband in 1864, stating he'd mistreated her throughout their marriage and beat their 3 children, their first baby Edward being hit when just weeks old, which resulted in a brain injury. In his defence of the proceedings, he claimed he was never cruel to her, but also that she had colluded in cruelty. Hopley was found guilty in July 1864 of cruelty, but they thought Fanny had indeed colluded. The judge decided there wasn't enough evidence, so refused to grant her the divorce. She ended up leaving England, most likely to get away from him. As for Hopley, he died on 24th June 1876.